Preaching is a wonderful thing and a mysterious thing. And if God has called us to the ministry, God is involved in what we preach, when we preach it, where we preach it from in the Bible. A number of years when I was first preaching, I thought that to be alive to your subject and to be moved by your subject and to be taken up by your subject is so primary that if you've got that right, if you're really enthused and moved, then it doesn't matter too much how you present it. The first thing is, are you yourself awake to it and alive to it and so on? Well, there's truth in that, of course, but God has so created us that people think logically and clearly. The man in the street who's never been through much formal training, he still thinks in a structural way. And if we just hand out truth without real form to it, not in a way that is easily remembered, well, we're missing something. He should be able to hand his material over to people in a form that they can carry away. Preaching, what an old preacher said, is to strike and stick. And it's not likely to stick if it's just poured out in a diffuse sort of mass. It needs to be put in a form that someone can carry away. Preaching is a wonderful thing and a mysterious thing. And if God has called us to the ministry, God is involved in what we preach, when we preach it, where we preach it from in the Bible, and a whole range of things. Now that's in turn related to who we're preaching to. And our formal training doesn't prepare us for that. We may find we're preaching to a different set of people than we ever thought we'd preach to. There may be people that have been subjected to certain influences that have to be addressed, and congregations differ enormously. Even today, I've often said to friends, if you were called to preach in the north of Scotland, in a certain spiritual culture, or in Swansea or in South Wales, you would find considerable differences in the congregations, and how you approach those differences from Scripture will vary. What your emphasis is, what scriptures you're led to. If a man hears an eminent preacher and gets the impression that's the way to preach, in some ways that's good, but in other ways it's dangerous. Dr. Lloyd-Jones, for example, was 20 years preaching before he began consecutively a passage of Scripture. Why? He needed the experience first. And so for a young man to say, oh yes, preaching has to be expository, I'm going to start in the Old Testament in the morning and something at night, it's a dangerous thing to do. You better find out whether you can do it. In other words, gifts develop, things come with experience, and if people like Spurgeon felt that they were not gifted to preach consecutively through passages, we better be careful about assuming that I can do it. Illustrations are really important. Some of the greatest preachers haven't used illustrations much at all, and we differ. And to overuse illustrations is worse than not having any illustrations. And that has caused some people to drop illustrations. But a good illustration is something that really does illustrate the biblical point you're making. And if you can draw it from another part of the Scripture, that's first class. We don't need to be running for books to illustrations. And that's another thing. We need to know our whole Bibles. And so a good theological training is a training that requires a knowledge of the whole Scripture. So illustrations can be drawn from Scripture very helpfully, and they can be drawn from church history, and they can be drawn and should be drawn where possible from, if they're not from the Bible, from books that are accessible to men. But some contemporary preachers like John MacArthur, for example, he will draw lessons from church history that send men onto that subject and they follow it up. So I'm a great believer in that. Lloyd-Jones was a master in doing that. Illustrations can be gained everywhere and from everyday life. They shouldn't all be from the 17th century or anything like that.